My name is Kevin Berger, and I am the author of Atheism is Untenable. On this channel, I don't engage in apologetics. Instead, I apply the principles of polemics and skepticism to atheism and the claims made by atheists. This is Justified Nonetheless. Please like, share, subscribe, and turn on those notifications.
What's up, my tumbleweeds? As I have noted many times in the past, it fills me with a sense of wonder how skeptics and atheists can be so absolutely gung-ho about evidence and the burden of proof when it comes to all sorts of claims. And they can demonstrate a keen grasp on these concepts until I ask for evidence for the claimed distinction between the dissent to a proposition and the assent to its negation, between a lack of belief and disbelief. It is at that point that they will suddenly feign incomprehension, as if they have no idea what evidence is or how the burden of proof works. So let's get back to business. Let's get back to basics. The burden of proof is the obligation of a party to provide sufficient evidence or reasoning to support their claim. This responsibility falls on the person who makes a specific claim. If you make a claim, you are required to back it up with credible evidence or a logical argument that can reasonably convince others of its truth. Recall that because arguments are composed of claims, if you're arguing, you're making claims. And yes, you do incur a burden of proof accordingly. Evidence is any information, data, or material that serves to support the truth of a claim. Evidence provides a basis for justification, enabling others to assess the likelihood that the proposition is accurate or reliable. Evidence can take various forms depending on the field and the nature of the claim. However, for our purposes, I'm deliberately disqualifying all but empirical evidence. For example, there is analogical evidence, anecdotal evidence, character evidence, circumstantial evidence, corroborative evidence, demonstrative evidence, digital evidence, documentary evidence, emotional evidence, empirical evidence, expert opinion evidence, forensic evidence, habit evidence, hearsay evidence, personal experience evidence, physical evidence, prima facie evidence, statistical evidence, symbolic evidence, testimonial evidence, and trace evidence. Most, if not all of these, are admissible in court as evidence, whether anyone considers them to be sufficient, conclusive, or compelling or not. They are forms of evidence, and every self-identifying atheist has been presented with at least one of these. So when people say that there is no evidence for a deity, it's simply false. The watchmaker argument is an example of analogical evidence. Sacred texts are examples of documentary evidence. The words of the clergy are examples of expert witness evidence. Proselytization is an example of testimonial evidence. It doesn't matter how poor one considers the evidence. Evidence doesn't cease to be evidence simply because one is unconvinced by it. But that's okay. That's okay. If atheists do not want to accept these forms of evidence for the claimed existence of a deity, that's their prerogative. They just have to apply the same standard to all claims to avoid the commission of a special pleading and be exposed as a logically inconsistent interlocutor. So no, I will not accept analogies as evidence for the existence of the claimed distinction between a lack of belief and disbelief, which is analogical evidence, and neither should they. I will not accept their self-reports, which are testimonial evidence of their alleged lack of belief, and neither should they. I will not accept their logical arguments, which may be prima facie or expert opinion evidence, and neither should they. Not if they want to be logically consistent and avoid special pleadings. No, as I said, I will only accept empirical evidence for the claimed distinction between the assent to a proposition and the dissent to its negation, because that's the standard that they have set. Hence, I submit the following pair of syllogisms. Premise 1. For a proposition P to be considered knowledge, P must be believed. The subject must perceive its veracity as being greater than its falsity. The belief in P must be justified. It must actually be more likely to be true than untrue. And P must actually be true. It must conform to reality. Premise 2. For belief in P to be justified, it must be supported by empirical evidence. Premise 3. Empirical evidence is evidence that is observable by the senses, measurable, quantifiable, and objectively verifiable. Conclusion. Therefore, if P is unsupported by evidence that is observable by the senses, measurable, quantifiable, and objectively verifiable, it does not qualify as knowledge. As a proof of concept, let's apply this first syllogism to the premise, at least one deity exists. Premise 1. For a proposition to be considered to be knowledge, it must be believed, the belief must be justified, and it must actually be true. Premise 2, for the belief to be justified, it must be supported by empirical evidence. Premise 3, the empirical evidence is observable by the senses, quantifiable, and objectively verifiable. Therefore, if the proposition at least one deity exists is unsupported by evidence that is observable by the senses, quantifiable, and objectively verifiable, it does not qualify as knowledge. I don't think that any atheist will object to the assessment that the proposition at least one deity exists does not qualify as knowledge, precisely because we don't have evidence that is observable by the senses, quantifiable, and objectively verifiable. Now, let P equal that assent to the proposition does not imply assent to its negation. Since we don't have evidence that is observable by the senses, quantifiable, and objectively verifiable, that claim fails too, and for the exact same reason. Atheists simply have replaced one unsubstantiated claim with another equally unsubstantiated claim. Now, let's consider the second syllogism. Premise 1. The objection that a demand for empirical evidence in support of a claim is unreasonable implies that the accumulation and presentation of evidence is too difficult or potentially impossible. Premise 2. That which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Conclusion. Therefore, the inherent difficulty or potential impossibility in the accumulation and presentation of evidence in support of a claim does not absolve one of the burden of proof for said claim. Premise 3. If the accumulation and presentation of evidence in support of a claim is deemed to be too difficult or potentially impossible, this is a de facto concession that the claim is unfalsifiable. Premise 4. A claim that is not falsifiable is unknowable and unscientific. Premise 5. A claim that is unscientific should be dismissed by default. Conclusion 2. Therefore, if the objection that a demand for evidence in support of a claim is deemed unreasonable, said claim should be dismissed by default. That because beliefs are the product of chemical reactions, electrical impulses in the brain, and thus manifest in reality as corresponding brain activity, which is empirically observable, measurable, and testable, a genuine difference in said activity has already been substantiated between atheists and religious people. Therefore, it can hardly be considered unreasonable to expect that the claimed distinction between the brain activity of self-identifying atheists who express belief in the non-existence of any deity, and that of self-identifying atheists who express a mere lack of belief in any deity, to be substantiated in similar fashion anyway. Thus, I contend that the objection that such a demand for evidence is unreasonable is attempted to gain a dialectical advantage by creating a facade of intellectual superiority and an asymmetry with regard to the burden of proof by sidestepping the need for epistemic justification. So, the question is, do you atheists have any empirical evidence at all for the claimed distinction between not believing a claim and believing its negation? I'm waiting.